Somewhere in the mountains between France and Spain lives a people who do not fit. Not linguistically, not genetically, not historically. They speak a language with no known relatives on Earth. Their blood tells a story no other European population tells. And for centuries, every explanation offered for who they really were turned out to be wrong. I first came across the Basques while researching something else entirely, stumbled into the linguistic rabbit hole, and genuinely could not find my way back out. The DNA findings that finally answered the question didn't simplify anything. They made it stranger. Start with the simplest version of the problem. Every language spoken in Europe today, French, German, Russian, Greek, Hindi, if you trace it back far enough, descends from a single ancestral tongue, Proto-Indo-European. A language spoken somewhere on the Eurasian steppe thousands of years ago that spread, fragmented, and eventually became the entire linguistic landscape of a continent. Every language except one. Euskera, the Basque language, does not belong to that family. It does not belong to any family. It stands completely alone, with no known relatives living or dead, no ancestor language that linguists can identify, no connection to anything else that has ever been spoken on this planet. That is not a small anomaly. That is a linguistic impossibility that somehow kept happening anyway. The details make it stranger. Euskera contains no meaningful Latin borrowings, despite the Romans occupying the region for centuries and absorbing virtually every other culture they touched. Its counting system runs in base 20 rather than base 10, suggesting a mathematical framework that developed in complete isolation from the numerical thinking that organized the rest of the ancient world. And certain Basque words, aits for rock, for water, su for fire, are so structurally primitive that linguists believe they may represent some of the oldest surviving vocabulary in any living human language. I spent an afternoon once trying to learn basic Basque phrases before a trip through the Pyrenees. 10 minutes in, I genuinely wondered if I was reading the page correctly. It does not yield. It does not offer handholds. Nothing about it reminds you of anything you already know. That experience, frustrating as it was, turned out to be the first real clue. A language that resists everyone for a reason, and that reason, it turns out, runs deeper than linguistics. The linguistic mystery was strange enough. Then scientists looked at the blood, and the argument got considerably more complicated. In the 1940s, medical researchers studying Basque populations made a discovery that nobody had a clean explanation for. The Basques carried the highest concentration of Rh-negative blood of any population on Earth. Depending on the specific community studied, the figure ran as high as 47%. The European average sits around 15%. They also showed unusually high rates of type O blood, creating a combined genetic profile that had no real parallel anywhere else on the continent. Here is why that mattered beyond the purely medical. Rh-negative blood frequency is not stable across mixing populations. When distinct populations intermarry and integrate over generations, Rh-negative rates tend to drop toward a regional mean. The fact that Basque populations had held these concentrations so far above everything around them pointed in one direction only. They had not been mixing, not recently, and possibly not for a very long time. What the blood studies could not tell you was why. Two competing theories immediately emerged and immediately stalled. Either the Basques were the remnant descendants of Europe's original pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, a population that had occupied the continent before farming arrived and simply never absorbed the waves of newcomers that followed. Or they were migrants from somewhere unknown, arriving in the Pyrenees from an origin point that left no obvious trace, becoming isolated after the fact rather than before it. Both arguments had something going for them. Neither had enough evidence to close the debate. The tools required to settle it simply did not exist yet. For decades, the Basques remained exactly what they had always been, a question that kept returning, an answer that kept retreating. Then the age of ancient DNA arrived, and everything changed direction at once. In 2021, an international team led by Dr. David Comas at the University of Barcelona published what remains the most comprehensive genetic analysis of Basque populations ever conducted. 600,000 genetic markers. 200 Basque individuals selected specifically because all four of their grandparents were born in the same micro-geographical areas. Nearly 2,000 comparison individuals drawn from across Europe and the Mediterranean. The methodology was designed to be definitive, and the results were. What they found was not what the exotic migration theory had predicted. There was no mysterious outside ancestry arriving from an unknown origin point. No ghost population, no vanished civilization depositing its genetics into the Pyrenees and disappearing. What the data showed instead was something in some ways more remarkable. Continuity. Extraordinary, almost unbroken continuity stretching back over 2,500 years to the Iron Age. Here's the detail that stopped me when I first read it. Basque genetic profiles from Iron Age burials are virtually indistinguishable from modern Basque populations. Most European populations show dramatic genetic transformation over just a few centuries as migration and conquest do their inevitable work. The average Spaniard today carries ancestry traceable to at least 6 distinct major population groups: Romans, Visigoths, Moors, earlier Iberian farmers, steppe migrants, and others moving through across millennia. The Basques absorbed almost none of it. While the entire genetic landscape of Europe was being rewritten around them, they remained essentially unchanged. Dr. Comas described the findings as unlike anything previously documented in Europe. That is not casual scientific understatement. That is a researcher who has spent a career studying human genetic variation telling you that what he found had no real precedent. The Basques were not migrants from somewhere strange. They were the original population, still there, still themselves. The mystery was not where they came from, it was how they managed to stay. The continuity finding was remarkable enough on its own. Then the researchers looked more carefully at the internal patterns within the Basque population itself, and the picture became something genuinely unexpected. The genetic isolation did not happen passively. It was not simply a matter of mountains and geography creating natural barriers that kept outside populations at a distance. The Pyrenees are real, but they are not the Himalayas. People crossed them regularly throughout history. Trade moved through them. Armies moved through them. What the data revealed was that the primary mechanism preserving Basque genetic distinctiveness was not geography at all. It was language. The correlation was precise enough to be startling. Communities where Euskera had been continuously spoken showed the strongest genetic isolation. Regions where the language had historically been present but gradually lost showed intermediate patterns, a measurable blurring at the edges. Territories where Euskera had never been spoken showed substantially more mixing with surrounding populations. The language boundary and the genetic boundary were effectively the same boundary. The granular detail goes further. Different Basque dialects correlated with distinct genetic subdivisions within the population. Researchers could predict, with meaningful accuracy, which dialect a person spoke based on their DNA profile alone. Communities separated by 15 kilometers showed genetic differences that would be unremarkable between populations on opposite sides of a continent. Take the Roncal Valley in Navarre, a community of shepherds speaking their own distinct variant of Euskera whose genetic patterns had remained stable for over 1,000 years. Marriage records from the 16th century show that more than 90% of Basques married within their own dialect group. Not just the same language, the same specific variant of it. Euskera was not a symptom of Basque isolation. It was the mechanism. The language was the wall. And for 2,000 years, it held. Pull back from the genetic detail for a moment and consider what it actually means. Europe, as most people understand it genetically, is a palimpsest. Layer written over layer over layer. Anatolian farmers arriving and displacing the original hunter-gatherers. steppe pastoralists sweeping in from the east during the Bronze Age and reshaping the genetic landscape of virtually the entire continent. Romans, Germanic tribes, Slavic expansions, the slow churn of medieval migration doing their work on top of all of that. The European gene pool as it exists today is the product of repeated overwriting. The original text is almost entirely gone. Almost entirely. The Basques represent what geneticists formally call a genetic refuge, a population that absorbed so little of the successive migration waves that reshaped everything around them that their genome still carries the signature of Europe before the overwriting began. When researchers compare modern Basque DNA against ancient European samples predating the Great Bronze Age population movements, the resemblance is striking in a way it simply is not for any other living population on the continent. When you look at a Basque person today, you are looking, in a measurable biological sense, further back into European prehistory than almost anywhere else it is possible to look. The cultural evidence reinforces this at every level. The Basque inheritance system, the Itixi, concentrated property within single-family lines and naturally discouraged outside marriages. Basque women held property rights and social freedoms that were essentially unheard of elsewhere in medieval Europe, which meant they married within their communities by choice rather than being traded outward by necessity. Their mythology features ancient earth goddesses predating any Indo-European religious framework. These are not colorful folklore details. They are corroborating testimony from a completely different category of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. Something here was preserved that everywhere else was lost. Here is the thing that stays with me after spending weeks inside this research. The Pyrenees did not save the Basques. That is the comfortable geographic explanation, and the data does not support it. Plenty of populations lived behind more formidable natural barriers and were still genetically transformed beyond recognition within a few centuries. Mountains slow armies. They do not stop ideas, traders, or the slow gravitational pull of neighboring cultures across generations. Something else was operating here. What the evidence points toward is collective will. A community that made, generation after generation, the decision to remain itself, to marry within the language, to pass property through established lines, to maintain traditions that created social networks dense enough and self-contained enough that outside influence simply found no easy entry point. The language was the mechanism, but the language itself was a choice that had to be renewed constantly, taught to children, preserved through periods when abandoning it would have been considerably more convenient. That has implications beyond the Basques specifically. It suggests that cultural identity, maintained deliberately and passed forward with genuine intention, can be more durable than any physical barrier humans have ever constructed. The medical dimension adds a practical dimension to the philosophical one. Because Basque populations represent such an unusually unmixed genetic baseline, they have become genuinely valuable to disease researchers trying to understand human biology before centuries of admixture complicated the picture. Their isolation, which looked for so long like a curiosity, turns out to be a scientific resource, and the genetic thread runs into the present. Into people in Bilbao and Bayonne and San Sebastian today, carrying something ancient and continuous in their biology, something that connects them directly to a Europe that no longer exists anywhere else. That is not a metaphor. That is a measurable biological fact. The DNA did not solve the Basques. It confirmed that the mystery was always real. What the genetics added was not a simple answer, but something more valuable. Proof that a people can remain genuinely, measurably themselves across 2,000 years of pressure, invasion, and transformation happening on every side. Not by accident, not by geography, by choosing to, continuously, across hundreds of generations. That is what makes them extraordinary. Not that they survived. Plenty of cultures survived in some diluted form. The Basques survived intact, a living thread reaching back to a Europe that exists nowhere else, still speaking the impossible language, still themselves.